Hello, hi, and welcome. If you are new here, my name is Sarah, and this is Wicked Reading. I am going to talk about every single book that I've read so far this year. Now, I'm going to make this a speed run, hopefully, because I have vlogged almost every single one of these books on my channel some way, somehow this year. So look back to my vlogs, ask me in the comments down below what books are in what vlogs if you want to hear more in-depth thoughts. All of the vlogs are spoiler free unless otherwise stated, and I will go way more into depth in my thoughts with those vlogs. We're going to keep it brief here because I have a lot of books to talk about. I actually don't even know how many. I think 48-ish, almost 50 books we're going to talk about today. That said, I'm going to talk about all these books in ranked order from the very worst book that I've read so far this year up into the very best. That said, though, some of these could be like switched around a little bit in their general grouping. I'm not going to give my individual ratings for every single one of these, but there is a general grouping that these will abide by. So I'm going to have them broken down into a little bit of grouping for you if you want to navigate through. The first group of books are ones that I straight up did not like. So these are going to be books that are like 2 stars and below, 2.25 stars and below. The next group are going to be ones that are forgettable. So these are going to be between like 2, 2.5, maybe a 3 stars in there. But these are books that were forgettable that I read. They left no impression, didn't necessarily hate them, didn't like them either though. So like I can't confidently recommend these either, but they weren't egregiously bad. The next group is going to be just the fine / the good ones. The ones obviously that I talk about first are going to be straight up like meh, fine, whatever. Kind of like whatever books. Once it gets closer to the top of that ranking, they're going to be more of the like good. Period. So these are going to be ones that I, recommend to the people that it seems like they're going to be good for, but I was mostly disappointed in them. The next grouping will be recommended books. So these are going to be 3.5s up until like 4, maybe a 4.5 might be at the top of that list. And I thought it was a solid book. So those are going to just fall under recommend in general. Then the last group is going to be the amazing ones. These are the ones that stood out that I'm still thinking about that will likely find a way into my top 10 books at the end of the year, unless some of these get booted out. But as of right now, these are my top favorite books I've read so far. Amazing. No notes, or either I liked it so much that ignore the notes. You know what I mean? But it is just a general ranking. I'm only saying this for me because I'm the type of person that I feel like once I say something, it is written in stone. And I just want to make it clear that some of these could be moved around a little bit, okay? I don't have to die with this ranking system engraved into my gravestone. So first, let me tell you guys about the books I DNF'd because these fall outside of the ranking system because I did DNF these. Well, the 2 I DNF'd because they were so bad that I wasn't going to read the rest of the book. The first DNF's a little bit of a weird one though. So I DNF'd Where the Dead Wait by Allie Wilkes. This I DNF'd, I was listening to the audiobook and I really liked the audiobook narrator, but his voice was almost so soothing that I would not listen to the story. I was just hearing the tremble and the bass of his voice that the words he was speaking meant nothing. It was just the lull of his voice that was working for me. So I really wasn't engaged in the story and I wasn't disliking it, but I wasn't engaged in it. So I just eventually ended up DNFing it because I realized I really couldn't even tell you what was going on. It felt like the same thing kept happening over and over again, and I didn't know if it was because the book felt like it was very repetitive or I just was only hearing those parts, you know what I mean? So I felt like I couldn't fairly assess or analyze the book as I had been reading it anyways. So I did DNF this. This is a historical Arctic horror where this ship goes out to this Arctic territory. It ends up getting stuck. The trip does not go well. And there's a lot of trauma and turmoil that ends up happening. And when the sailors get back, one of those co-captains ends up going back to that area and everybody loses contact with them. So another person from the original voyage has to go follow him. And there's these subtle hints that potentially they either had a relationship or just one of the men was into the other man. But again, I don't feel like I can even really give you guys a good synopsis because I just felt so disengaged with the story. I think that based on my experience, maybe it was too long for what it was. It has this supernatural, like potential supernatural atmosphere going on. And it had just like a very slow atmospheric type of approach. So if you're into that, there you go. But I do know that it has a very low average rating. I would be curious to read some of the reviews of people that have actually finished it. This is one I would consider going back to, but with how many other books I want to read, I don't feel super compelled to go back to this one. So this is like a medium DNF where I could potentially go back to this, but I don't really know. These next two, though, I will not go back to. The first one being The Temptation of Magic by Megan Scott. I actually read the first chapter of this in my video where I speed date my fairy loot collection, because I have a lot of backlog collection of fairy loot that I haven't subscribed to for years. This is one I decided to keep, despite the fact that in that video, I dogged the writing. The writing is not good in this book. The writing is not good. It is a somewhat academic set. Like the academia of the book is not the main focus. It is simply a backdrop. But it sells itself as like a dark academic fantasy romance. We follow a main character whose mom, I believe, is missing. Either is missing or dead, I forget now. Oh yeah, because I think her mom ended up potentially getting killed by this society that oversees supernatural beings, but she gets killed and the daughter believes that her mom has been leaving clues to help her family kind of continue to run from this secret organization. And she believes a clue is in this one particular painting, so she's at university to study art history, because there's also a bunch of secret nods to the fact that supernatural exists in this world that is symbolized within art that the mortals have no idea is like true supernatural thing. So whatever, she's trying to look into this painting, and the collector of this painting, like the person who had this painting in their possession, ends up being killed and the painting goes missing. So this organization ends up sending one of their people in order to investigate and figure out what's going on and potentially kill whatever person or supernatural thing killed that other person and stole the art. So then Nicole and this person, his name's Kyan, they end up crossing paths, and it's a fantasy romance, so it turns into a romance between them. I didn't get far enough to the point that there was any type of romance because the writing is so bad. I mean, I already knew that the writing was going to be bad, but I thought it might still end up being fun in the way that like Twilight is bad but fun. And I even mentioned that in that video, and it turns out this is like somewhat of like a fan fiction or inspired or something by Twilight. And I just want to say I called that. I had no idea about that, but it felt like I literally said it felt like it belonged in the era of Twilight. That is what this book feels like. But also it's just like not good. The plotting was horrible. There was so many conveniences and so many conflicting things up until the point that I read it. I don't even know how far I got into it. I think I got just over 100 pages into it. And yeah, it just really wasn't working for me. And I couldn't see past the flaws of the plotting and the characters and the conveniences to enjoy anything. There was like nothing left for me to enjoy. So I gave it up. Okay, this next DNF I'm gonna look up because these DNFs are tough for me to synopsize for you guys. So I did also DNF The Darkness Within Us by Tricia Levenseller. I don't know how far I got into this, but not super far because this sucked so bad. Like the main character is so annoying. So this follows a main character, Chrysantha Stathos, who is like masking as a bimbo. The very beginning of the book opens up where she's just waiting for her old husband to die so she could just like take his money and the wealth that he owes her and she can move on with her life and do what she wants to do. And then he dies. And then this man shows up who is supposedly her husband's estranged grandson. And she was under the impression that he had no family, so she was guaranteed his wealth. But then this man shows up and he's like, hey, that was my grandfather. Like, I'm part of this property, whatever the hell. And that becomes an issue. And literally that's all I read up to because so much of our characters' internal thoughts are bashing other women. She's like so internally misogynistic, and it's not like on purpose, I don't think. I don't think it was like a choice for this character to be that way. Maybe it was, but nonetheless, it wasn't like a fun thing to read. And it just, I forget even what happened. It ended up being so much more almost like gaudy than I expect. I don't know if gaudy is the right word, but almost more gaudy than I expected. In the very little that I read, she ended up going to almost like a whorehouse, but with men. It was like a one chapter thing where she decided to just like go on a sexual prowl and do whatever she wanted to do. And then we like just move on from that. And I don't know, it was just like not good. And I didn't really understand what we were going for. She has like this really bitter jealousy against her sister, who apparently we follow in the first book. So I don't know why. This is like kind of a sequel, but not a sequel. It's like a companion book, but it's written where you definitely need to read the other book, because I was so lost on what was going on, because the way everything was talked about was as if I should know all of this. Names were being dropped, places were being dropped with absolutely no description or no context around anything. So I was completely lost. Didn't like the character, didn't like the language or the writing. It was just like not, it was just not good. So I DNF'd it. Okay, so now getting into the actual rankings, I'm going to go through these hopefully even quicker, because I feel like I'm already not speed running this like I said I would. So the very worst book I've read so far this year is The Luminous Dead by Caitlin Starling. This sucked. This sucked so bad. The point of the story, the synopsis of the story, is that we follow our main character, Jair, and she is a caver, which is somebody who goes into these caves and kind of navigates through in order for whoever hires them to be able to create maps of these caves and sell them to people to mine through them, stuff like that. So she is desperate for money because she wants to go to another planet to follow the mother that left her when she was young. And so she ends up taking this job offering that is for a lot of money, but very quickly into the job, she realizes there has been a lot of failed attempts at this particular mission, at this particular cave. There's been multiple deaths and a lot of people completely bailed, but she needs the money, so she just like keeps going on. And then her only support staff in this cave is this woman named M, who we find out very early on is actually the person also in charge of the cave. Like, she is the one who wants this cave to be mapped out or whatever. She seems to be looking for something in particular. And typically a caver has like a full support staff, but she only has M. M is just in her ear 24/7 with this like super high-tech suit on, and they end up forming the worst relationship I've ever read. And you are not supposed to think it's a bad relationship. I think you are supposed to be rooting for them, but they are the most toxic. Literally the whole book, the entire time, it was just them bickering about something traumatic happening to Jair, so then they trauma bond over that, and then M would end up doing something super, super messed up. She literally drugs Jair through her suit. She forces Jair to like go to sleep multiple times. She manipulates, lies, and crosses so many boundaries with Jair. And then they end up making up. And then Jair's like, oh my God, like she's so beautiful. She's just my type. Hello? I don't understand. I don't understand. This is supposed to be like a sci-fi horror, but you get like 2 chapters of the sci-fi world, and it is not well explored. It is not well fleshed out. It is not well thought out. This was just pretty much a character study of these 2 characters getting into the worst relationship I've ever witnessed and being so incredibly annoying the whole way through. I hated this. I will say it wasn't poorly written. It was at least well written for what it was, but it was just like the worst characterization, the worst world building, the worst plotting ever. Next is Audition. This is by Ryu Murakami. This is following a man who has recently lost his wife, and he decides he wants to enter the dating scene again. So he puts on this charade that there is going to be this movie in order to lure all these young actresses to audition for this fake movie. And through these auditions is where he will pick out the woman he wants to date. date. He ends up finding the woman he wants to date. They end up going on dates, and most of the book is literally them going on dates. It's a lot of the culture and the restaurant life. And the food of this area. I think this takes place in Japan, I want to say. And so it's just like a lot about the cuisine and the restaurants. And then there's this really, really strange sex scene that I felt super uncomfortable reading. I don't know if it was more so translation. It felt like a sex ed, just like too formal of a like sex scene. And it's written by a man. So there was just like no... It was just not for me. It was just not for me. How about that? And then the ending, I kept pushing through because I thought that this was going to be a very revenge femme fatale type of story, but it really dropped the ball and did not deliver that for me. The most brutal killing happens to a dog. It was so disturbing, and that was the most brutal scene of the whole book. Like, no human ends up going through. I don't even know if any human died except one at the end, in which it ended up being a person that just made the whole thing feel so not worth it. And it made them look so dumb. So dumb. And like the action of the book really only takes place in like the last 5 or so pages. So I hated this. I don't think it's worth it. I don't really know why people like it, quite frankly. Cool if you do like it. I don't get it. This next one's a little controversial because a lot of people do love this, but... Not I, said the fly. And that is You Weren't Meant to Be Human by Andrew Joseph White. This was not for me. I think it had some really well done paragraphs and some really well done moments, but so much of the in-between was very sloppy world building, very sloppy plotting, and I could not stand this main character. Until the end, like by the end, I couldn't stand the main character, Crane. I felt for him. I was so empathetic with him most of the way through the book, but he is the most self-destructive character, which is one thing. But he's not just self-destructive. He also brings down the people around him that were his only support system. He brings them down and ruins them so badly, and it made me so mad. There was one relationship Crane had with this person named Stagger, and I was rooting so hard for a tender friendship between the two. And the direction it goes just really let me down. And then the ending of this book is so brutal. And it just was another ending that made me feel like, what was the point in everything? Which, like, isn't always necessarily a bad thing. Like, I don't mind a bleak ending all the time, but I just didn't appreciate it in this case, I guess. I didn't even say what this is about, but this is about a transgender man named Crane who is part of this cult that worships and works for this alien-esque creature. It's just this conglomerate of worms and flies and whatever and larvae, and they just bring the conglomerate dead bodies once in a while to feed them. And like, that's it. I feel like saying it's a cult book also very much oversells it because that aspect is not explored very well either, in my opinion. And the whole point of the book is that Crane ends up getting pregnant and he doesn't want to keep the baby, but the hive forces him to keep it because he feels indebted to the hive because they accepted him for who he is. And yeah, we follow the journey of the pregnancy and how it ends up at the end. And it's just like a lot of gore and nastiness. And it felt like a lot of the time, it felt like it was being gory and nasty for the sake of being gory and nasty and shock value-esque versus really taking on some sort of nuanced tone to the commentary of body autonomy. The themes it was approaching, I just felt like ended up feeling secondary to what was happening on page, to the gore and the shock on page. The themes kind of fell to the background, and I wanted the themes to be more of the forefront. I compare this a lot to Brainworms by Alison Rumfitt, in which very similar topics are explored, as well as that book being very subversive and transgressive and gory and gross and makes your skin crawl. But I feel like it just takes on the themes with so much more of an interesting approach The writing, like the formatting that Alison Rumfitt goes for is so experimental in itself. And I love Alison Rumfitt. She's another transgender author. And I really like that book over You Weren't Meant to Be Human. But these two are very, very comparable. One just like greatly outdid the other in my mind. So if you didn't like You Weren't Meant to Be Human, but you still like the idea of it, read Brainworms. Ooh, this next one I feel like is also a little bit controversial, and that is Staircase in the Woods by Chuck Wendig. I did not like this. It was so hard not to completely compare it to It by Stephen King. We were following a group of people that were friends when they were young. And during that time, they were just like outside in the woods one day, and a staircase randomly shows up. One of their friends goes up the staircase, and the staircase disappears, and their friend is gone. And it is now 20-ish years later. And the group is going to get back together to find this friend because they figured out that a staircase showed up somewhere else. So yeah, they end up finding another staircase, and they as adults go up the staircase, and it turns into this kind of trippy liminal space horror with kind of like a gaming element to it, which I was really on board with the gaming element. I thought that was cool, and that was what I liked most about this book. That said, though, it took up to like 30%, like a third of this book, for them to get to the staircase. So the beginning, the exposition felt very long and not super interesting. There were these monologues, these political monologues within the book, these very anti-MAGA monologues, which don't get me twisted. I am very anti-MAGA, but these monologues felt extremely misplaced in the context of what the characters were going through. There's absolutely no subtext, and it just felt very virtue signally. It just felt pandering. It didn't feel like a well thought out thing. It didn't make me think any different type of way. It just didn't do anything new. It was like a talking head, talking points about that whole being like anti-MAGA thing. Like it was just like the bullet points of that, and it took me out of the story, and it just really plopped it as a modern day story for today. You know what I mean? So I didn't like that, but I also just didn't really love the writing in general. The writing is very, I was going to say tacky, but that's a little bit mean. It's just very crass. We'll go with crass. It's just very crass. The jokes aren't my type of humor. This was my second time reading a Chuck Wendig, and I officially don't think Chuck Wendig is an author for me. I think he writes the way he talks, and it's just like not the way I talk or want to hear people talk. So I just don't think that his books are going to be for me moving forward. I think this had a really interesting idea, but just lacked some originality. It felt very cliche a lot of the times. There were certain plot devices and plot points that felt just like I've read them somewhere else before. So it's not the worst, but it still is certainly one I could say I straight up did not like. This is me inserting into this slot because I completely forgot to have this book on my list at all. So arguably, maybe it should be in the forgettable category, but I can also sincerely say I did not like this book. I straight up did not like this book, and that is Not Quite Dead Yet by Holly Jackson. I listened to the audiobook. I do think that the audiobook narrator did a good job with the book, but the story itself, so the thing is, this is a thriller, and I will tell you later down the road that I notoriously don't like thrillers. I am not a thriller girly, but I continue to still try them anyways. I thought this one might be a little bit different for me. It wasn't. So we follow our main girl who somebody tries to murder in the very beginning of the book. She gets attacked, but she ends up surviving. But because of this attack, there is something in her brain that is still fatal. And the doctor gives her 7 days to survive if she doesn't undergo this very, very, very risky surgery. So she decides to just take the 7 days that she has left to survive in order to try to solve her own murder. And I just didn't like this character. I did not like this character. I thought she was extremely immature. You could not pay me to think that this woman was anywhere near 30. I think she's supposed to be 27 in the book, but she felt so immature. I didn't like her. I didn't like the way she strung a certain person around, the sweetest person ever. I feel so bad for him because he got strung along so bad. I don't like a murder mystery. I'm learning this about myself this year. Murder mysteries don't do it for me in themselves. And I kept getting taken out of the story because she kept referring to the 7 days she has left. And then the next day, I have 6 days left to live. And I hated that countdown approach because in reality, it wouldn't be like, I think that's my biggest issue with thrillers is it tends to require a lot of suspension of disbelief. And for whatever reason, I cannot get my mind to do that in a thriller that is supposed to take place in reality. I can suspend my disbelief with fantasy or supernatural horror or anything that already kind of just inherently has that necessity for suspending your disbelief already. For whatever reason, I just can't do it for thrillers. So they end up just never really working for me. So that whole countdown thing kept pissing me off. The character was pissing me off. At the end, oh my God, the end, she is like obviously preparing to die. So she ends up writing letters to all of these people in her lives as like her final words to these people. And the things that she was saying to some people, I would be so pissed off if I got one of these letters from her. She was an asshole. She was an asshole to the grave. So I did not like this character. I didn't like this character. It was a thriller that I just didn't fuck with, and that's that on that. Next is Itch by Gemma Amore. What a beautiful cover. So this is sad that I didn't like this. But you know, I didn't go into this with the highest expectations because I had heard pretty mixed things, but I did listen to it on audiobook, so I thought I'd give it a chance. This just was not it for me. If I would have read the synopsis, I would have known it wasn't going to be for me, but frankly, I didn't, and I just went into this book blind. This follows our main character. I think her name is Josie. It's either Josie or Jody. Something like that. Or Josephine. Something with a J and like a Joe. So we're going to call her Josie. Sorry, I don't have my phone with me and I don't have the book. I'm not going to look it up. Josie is our main character now. She is a very abused character. We immediately open up the book with a scene between her and her dad where it is very clear that he is not a supportive parent, that he is pretty abusive, and he just like does not take care of her and is not a good dad overall. But her mother had died when she was younger and her dad got really bad after that. Then we find out the way I'm giving you the synopsis is clunky, and that is because the way that this exposition is done is just as clunky as I'm giving it to you guys. So anyways, then we find out that Josie is escaping an abusive relationship with an ex, and she is running away from her abusive ex-girlfriend. So she ends up having to go back home to her abusive father. And when she is at home, back in her hometown that she hasn't been for however long, she's walking through a park and she finds a dead body. And that leads her to spiral. She becomes very obsessed with this body. She wants to learn about this person. She thinks that they look very much like her. And she just ends up wanting to find out everything she can about this victim, as well as trying to figure out what happened to her. And she immediately kind of thinks that this is a serial killer, and then she looks into all of these other crimes that she thinks are linked, and it literally becomes a serial killer mystery, which had I known that, I would not have picked up this book. But I really didn't realize what it was doing until like really far into it, and at that point I was just like, I'm just going to finish it because I read it in May. So I was reading it during a readathon month, and I wanted to just finish this book so I could help my team out for the readathon. So you're welcome, Team Scientist. I took this for you. Okay. I took the torture of reading the story for you. So it just turns into a mystery, but I feel like Josie was like one of the worst written characters ever, and not because she's a bad person or anything like that. Like, she's not an unlikable character. I think she was just so incredibly flat. She was so passive. She was truly just an abused character to be an abused character. And the whole thing with the aunts is that because of her trauma and her abuses that she has faced, It kind of gets symbolized and manifests as her believing that there's ants crawling all over her because there was like ants on the dead body and stuff like that. The premise of this sounds so good, of her finding a dead body and becoming obsessed with that. If you told me just that, I would be like, sign me up. That is a book for me, 5-star prediction. But this just really under-delivered that, and it shifts so much more into the serial killer mystery that ends up being so cheap. I feel like the way everything plays out was just like cheap, unbelievable. And it just, I mean, like, the point of the story is that Josie forgot a lot of stuff when she was a child because of trauma. Like, it's all focused around trauma, but I just don't feel like it was approached well. I don't feel like it was approached in a thoughtful way. I feel like it was just very one note. It really just felt like a surface level take on trauma and trauma responses, and it just didn't feel well researched. It felt like a single search was done on Wikipedia, and they were just like, what are some late adult life symptoms of childhood trauma? And they just like hit some of those. And our character literally, like, outward would speak and narrate, I did this and reacted this way because of my childhood trauma. Why are we writing this? Like, again, zero subtext, zero subtlety, and everything else, like, plot-wise, was cheap, in my opinion, of course. And the whole bug thing was the coolest aspect. This ant symbolism was the coolest thing, but even that ended up feeling very one note. It only comes up a couple of times, and it comes up the exact same way and in the exact same approach each time, and it just like wasn't well used. And I just feel like overall this book just wasn't like well crafted and didn't really do anything new or interesting for me. And I don't think it was like very well researched or very well written. I feel bad. Like, this is why I don't like talking about books from worst to best, because I feel like I am just shitting on books for so long before I can finally get to books that I'm like excited about. And I don't necessarily love to shit on books, but it's just the truth of the matter. I also am not speedrunning very well, but it's hard for me to speedrun through negative reviews because I feel like I really have to justify why I hated a book. You know what I mean? I don't feel like I have to say as much to prove why I loved a book. I feel like I have to say a lot to prove why I didn't like a book. But anyways, next one, All the Fiends of Hell by Adam Neville. Here's the thing. This one has a really, really solid novella within it. But this book is so incredibly bloated by way too much description, by way too much repetitiveness. This book overall is overwritten and too long for what it is. This is a sci-fi horror that we follow a main character who is in his 40s. And the very first chapter of the book is he is delirious with the flu. He has a fever, he's delirious, and he notices a red light outside of his window, and he sees all his neighbors outside, but like he can't even get up. He's like nauseous, he passes out on the ground, whatever. Next day, everybody's gone. All of his neighbors, his whole neighborhood has apparently disappeared, and you know it's an alien invasion story, so we end up following this main character traversing his new territory and trying to figure out what happened, running into other survivors along the way, trying to figure out why they survived, and he ends up kind of creating a little tag team of him and these two orphans he finds, trying to figure out and further survive this alien invasion and whatever. The thing is, the imagery in this book was so strong. The idea and the, again, imagery, I guess, of the aliens was so interesting and genuinely so creepy, but it got overly repetitive with plot points. I felt like the same thing kept happening to the characters. Once you reveal and see like the monster, the creature of a story, each time after that, I feel like it's weaker and weaker, and I feel like Adam Neville just had too many of those occurrences where by the end, by the 7th time I'm seeing these fuckers, I don't care anymore. Like, now they're not scary. They were extremely scary in the beginning, but once we survive so many interactions with them completely or nearly completely unscathed, they don't seem as much of a threat, even though they are, that it just like starts to not feel as tense or as high risk or whatever. I liked the idea of following this very unassuming character. He was not prepared for an apocalypse. He was not like a doomsday prepper. He was extremely mundane and average Joe. So I like the idea of following him and really not fully understanding why the aliens came or whatever, like not getting the big picture, because that's how it would work out in real life. I didn't mind not getting answers to that. I did really like learning a little bit more about the aliens as we went, as our character observed what the aliens would do or respond to or whatever. Getting to know those little bits along with the character, I did like that. But at the end of the day, the story just got so bogged down by way too much text, so overwritten. There was extremely repetitive things happening, both plot-wise and writing-wise. The character just kept circling through the same thoughts, would have the same conversations with any and every character he ran into. There was not enough room for the reader to breathe. Like, the reader was not allowed to have a single thought. Everything had to be written down in this book, and I just don't like that. I don't like that approach. I don't like when every single thought is spoon-fed to me. I can think on my own as a reader. I can use critical thinking. I can use context to ask myself certain questions for the book to then eventually answer, but I don't need the character to do everything for me. Not to mention, there's this really weird scene with a naked young girl that I don't like. The fact it was in there does not sit right with me because it was so unnecessary. I talk about it more in the vlog that I read this in. I read this in Horror Bingo number 3, and I talk about it pretty detailed there. But it just did not sit right with me. So the book was just not it. It had too many things against it for me to look past. Next one is Accumulation by Amy Potwatka. I have to pull up the synopsis for this because we are getting toward the forgettable territory, in which this is very close to that. This is a book that follows our main character, Tennessee. She was a documentary filmmaker, but she got married, had kids, and the book opens up with them having gotten her dream house, but there's some weird things. They end up finding a weird baby doll that keeps moving around the house. They find a tooth in the floorboards, and there's a bunch of weird stuff. So then it kind of becomes a story of, is this a haunted house? And what Tennessee is dealing with in the pressures of both motherhood and partnership. And initially, a lot of the book I felt like was trying to talk about the mundanity of everyday life, of doing the dishes and cleaning this and making dinner, and how it's so cyclical and how we get stuck in those boring cyclical things that we just have to get through to survive our day, and we don't really ever get to fully feel like we're living in the moment. So it had some of that, which I liked the idea of that, but this is another book in which I liked the ideas far better than the actual execution. I feel like this book ended up trying to do too many things where it didn't really know what it really wanted to be, and it didn't focus in enough on any particular theme or element. The haunted house thing gets so weird. I hated the way that the haunted house element was tied up in the end. The ultimate conclusion was so strange to me. Such an odd choice. Could not be me, and I cannot explain what it is without a spoiler, but it was the dumbest ending in my opinion. And the whole character interactions, like overall the writing felt very, very awkward to me. Conversations didn't really make sense. The husband absolutely sucks in this book, and I don't think that we were supposed to think that he sucks, but I was rooting for divorce. This book is marketed as motherhood, but I do think it's more so about partnerhood while having the added stresses of parenthood, of house ownership, of jobs, of all these other things. But again, I just don't feel like any particular theme was fully fleshed out or just really went there. There was some really interesting time loops, some trippy time loops, and I loved those aspects, and I just wish they went further and that part of the book was leaned into way more. But instead, we ended up getting some very, very random feeling and clunky plot points at the end. It just felt so messy by the end, and even anything with the haunted house aspect, particularly in the beginning, it just felt kind of tropey. The ending of the haunting aspect and how that tied up was unique, but again, not good. An odd choice in my opinion. So this just really under-delivered for me. Was it egregious? No, but do I recommend it? No, I don't think it was very well done, and it's borderline forgettable. So moving into the forgettable territory. Okay, so the first one being His Black Tongue by, I think it's Matthew Ludi. This is actually a book that is a bind-up of 3 stories, which I didn't realize when I started, but I listened to the audiobook, and I will say the audiobook production, particularly of the first story, is very, very well done. I feel like with each story, my attention greatly diminished. By the third story, all I could tell you was that had to do with the round table, the Knights of the Round Table, and that was it. And I really have no idea what else happened, quite honestly. The second story had to do with Vikings. The first story is really where it's at, in my opinion, and that follows these 2 people, one being like a preacher, a priest, they use another name for him, but some type of religious figure, along with a saint. It's during the era of the plague, and there's this one town that has not experienced the plague at all. There hasn't been a single person to catch the plague, so they decide to go there to kind of figure out why. Like, why is this one city seemingly immune to the plague? And when they go there, they realize that there was potentially a witch that made a deal with a devil. And then while they were there, they are trying to figure out that mystery. And, you know, it was pretty entertaining. And I did like the progression of the story, and I did like the way it ended. And the first story was really, really solid, honestly. It was mostly because the 2 other stories preceding it did not leave a single impression on me, that this ended up being a little bit lower. The first story on its own, pretty decent. The first story on its own is like fine and good, and then the other 2 are whatever. So those just kind of brought it down for me. I don't really have too much to say about it. It's a pretty simplistic story. If you want a story that is taking place in medieval times, here you go. And it's a quick audiobook listen, and it's a quick audiobook. So like, I do kind of recommend this, but just don't expect to be blown away by it, I guess, either. Next is Sugar Cane by Cassandra Celia. This is a shorter novella, and it follows a woman who finds out that her husband is a serial killer. And that's really all you got to know. Each chapter is a different time period. It kind of jumps back and forth, and I didn't like the layout of the time period and like how much it jumped back and forth, because the book opens up, I think, in present day, and then we jump back to 6 months before, and then we jump forward to this, and then we jump back to 12 years ago, and then we jump back to present day, and then we jump back to 3 years ago. So it was just very, like, the time was very jumpy, and I didn't really like that. It kind of just goes back and forth between her figuring out that he's a serial killer and what she's doing in response to that. And then how she had met her husband and how they got married and stuff like that. So, you know, this one was like fine. It just was missing seasoning. It was a bit bland. Again, I think this had a really solid idea, and I wish it just was a little bit more fluid in the way that the timeline was given. And I wish we just knew our main character, the wife, a little bit more, and we really followed a slower progression of the psychological challenges she had and how she decided to approach the situation with her husband and who he was and what he was doing. And I just wish there was a little bit more to her and the progression of her figuring that stuff out. I didn't give 2 shits about her having met her husband and how their relationship used to be so good. I didn't care about any of that. I just wanted to know about her finding out about him being a serial killer and all of the stuff that came after leading up to the end. But yeah, so I just feel like the focus and the time scope of this story kind of brought it down. And yeah, I just needed a little bit more. Oh my God, I literally forgot I read this. This is The Forest of Missing Girls. I don't remember the name of the author off the top of my head. I didn't write the authors down. Sorry, I was being lazy. I feel like it was Nichelle or something like that, something more unique. Here's the cover though, and you could see the author's name there. No disrespect, no shade to the author. My apologies, but you are in the forgettable category, you know? So this is a thriller, which I notoriously don't like thrillers. So it's not surprising that this is pretty low on my ranking. The story opens up where we are following our main girl, Leah. It's either Leah or Laya. I feel like it's Leah. And she has recently gone through a breakup, so she is going back to her hometown and going to stay in her childhood home for a little bit. and the forest around her house is really creepy. And this town is kind of known for always having a missing girl. And shortly after Leah gets home, one of her sister's friends ends up going missing. So she ends up kind of being entangled in this and trying to figure out where her sister's friend has gone and uncovering darker, sinister secrets of her town. I really don't have too much to say about this one. It was just, you guessed it, forgettable. There ended up being this kind of, I want to say some stuff without saying too much in case you're interested in it. I don't want to give any spoilers, but there's this kind of like tiny little dash of Frankenstein inspired thing going on. And I did think that that was interesting, but I ultimately didn't really love the direction it went in. I pretty much just remember how the book opened, in it just saying that the woods was really creepy and making that obvious, and the disappearance of the girl. And then I just remember how it ended. I know that there was a gun involved and I hate guns. Guns just make for such like an anticlimactic thing. And I feel like there was something at the end where one of the characters made a choice that was kind of like dumb to make, and then it ended up not even making a difference, and it was like made in order to save somebody else, but then it didn't even work. But then there turned out to be kind of like this other easy out for the character to getting around the thing that they chose to do without needing to choose to do it. You know what I mean? Like, it just that the ending was messy. As messy as that explanation was, that's how the ending felt to me. I didn't find it to be interesting, and it didn't leave an impression on me. Next is Thirst by Mariana. I do not know how to say this author's last name. My apologies. I looked up multiple interviews. My mouth cannot do it. But here it is. Here's the author. This is very literary. It's not really horror other than the fact that there is a vampire in the story. It is split into two parts. The first part following the vampire in question, and it really is just the story about this vampire's life and a couple of relationships that she had throughout her, I don't know, decades, centuries of living. Timeline wasn't super exact, but it's just following the vampire who remains unnamed the entire book and some of her relationships. And then it turns into the second half of the book where we are following a mortal woman who ends up crossing paths with this vampire, but she doesn't even end up really crossing paths with this vampire until I think almost 80% of the way into the book. Like, it takes a very, very, very long time for these two characters to ever interact. But the mortal woman is going through a hard time in her life where her mother is pretty much on her deathbed, and she is grappling with anticipatory grief and how to care for her mother, how to even be there for her mother and her son. She has a son. And you forget she has a son because some of the choices that she makes. But this mortal woman just kind of starts to become almost entranced with this graveyard that has ties to this vampire. I don't know. This was very underwhelming. Plot-wise, not much happens. Writing-wise, I didn't find it to be very interesting. The best part of this book was actually a few pages between part 1 and part 2, where it talks about the history of graves in general, and kind of how graves have developed over time, what they looked like when they started, and how they have become these kind of gated grave sites that we know today in these cemeteries. And I thought that was the most interesting part of the book. The characters were lukewarm at best. Where the story ends is where I wished it began, and I feel like there's so much more of an interesting story at the end of this book that we don't ever get to know. So didn't really like this. It's much more of a literary work, but the writing itself didn't really do much for me either. Next is The Shuddering by Anya Elborn. This is a creature feature in a snowy setting, and honestly, this one was fine. I forgot I read it, so I ended up putting it in forgettable, but I do think it's a pretty decent, entertaining creature feature if that's what you want. It reads like an early 2000s creature feature where there's like the zany comedic character that says whatever he wants and is misogynistic and says racist things and jokes against disabled people, and like it's just so 2000s. And then there's the other person who is supposed to be like the clear-headed, logical thinking, and I don't know, it just reads like a stereotypical early 2000s creature feature without all of the charisma that some certain 2000s creature features have. But we follow a brother and a sister who are going to their family's log cabin in the snowy forest by a ski resort for the last time because they are selling off that cabin. And the brother is about to move away. No, I forget. One of the siblings is about to move away to a different country. And the brother invites his friend, who was also an ex of the sister, like the one that got away type of ex. And then the brother's friend brings his new fiance, and it's just like this really weird mashup of these four characters, and they're trying to have like a last little hurrah before, I think it's before the brother goes away to another country for work. And yeah, they get stuck in this log cabin, and it's a creature feature. And I liked the creature feature aspect. Creature features in themselves don't necessarily always really do it for me, so it wasn't like a super strong read. It's just not a super strong subgenre for me in general, and it was fine. It was totally fine. Next is Guillotine by Delilah S. Dawson. This is a slasher. It's a very eat the rich type of slasher, warring class systems type of thing, where we follow our main character, Des, and she is an aspiring fashionista, a fashion designer, and she ends up hooking up with this guy, this rich guy. She is like not rich. She goes to the thrift store and tries to like sew and upscale thrift store types of clothes. But she really wants to get into like fashion school or like a really prestigious fashion internship. And it's really about who you know. And she doesn't really know anybody. But she ends up crossing paths with this rich dude who is connected. He's like in a family who is connected to this fashion mogul. His mom is like a fashion mogul, runs this super highly sought out fashion magazine. So Des decides to date him to get to his mother, even though she does not like this man. She thinks he's a pig, but she's just going through it so she can get where she needs to be. So she ends up weaseling her way into a family vacation at their private island that the family owns. And so she goes to this place, and it turns out that the workers of this family had something planned and wanted to seek revenge on this family over the weekend. So that is what happens, and it's a slasher in that way. Yeah, I thought that this was also just like fine and whatever. It was a very underwhelming slasher in terms of like the slashing scenes. Like there was a couple of ones that stuck out, but my main problem with this book is I felt like it was too stuck in the middle. For me, when I think of slashers or anything like that in the more kind of gory, violent realm of horror, I feel like there's two options. There's probably more, but in my head, there's like two options where an author can go in kind of a campy, over-the-top, zany direction with it, or it can go in like the very detailed, gruesome, serious, gory version of it. I just feel like this really fell in the middle and didn't commit to either side of the slasher spectrum in my mind. So for that, it just made it feel very, very mid and uninspired. A lot of the slashings were rooted in revenge, and I felt like every revenge reasoning we were given felt a little bit similar, just like kind of the same trauma, different flavor type of thing. So it felt a little bit one note in that way. And yeah, this just ended up being okay, an okay time, especially because it's so short. If it was long, I would have ended up more so not liking the story. Again, I like the idea of it being this kind of eat the rich approach, but I just felt like the execution was lacking. Next is We Can Never Leave This Place by Eric LaRocca. This was my first story by Eric LaRocca, and I went into this completely blind. What do I even say that this is about? Because it's very short. It's under 100 pages. This story is from the perspective of a younger child, and it is kind of alluded to that there was some sort of apocalyptic scenario outside, maybe some type of outbreak, something outside where people are staying in their houses. So whatever, I don't know. The outside world was just kind of alluded to, and I'm not fully clear on what was going on out there. But as far as what's going on in the house, we're following the young child's POV as she deals with the grief of losing her dad and her in the unfortunate circumstance of being left with her mother, who is less than pleasant. She is quite abusive. And it overall is the story of how children will deal with trauma. I'm trying to not say too much because again, I don't want to spoil anything with this book because it's so short. But at the core, it's about a child trying to survive a traumatic environment. So it was interesting. It's a weird one. My biggest gripe with it is I felt, again, like there was a little bit too much poop. A little too much poop and shock value stuff for the sake of being shock value. I will say I really did not like it most of the time, but at the end, the last chapter did make me appreciate the story more and appreciate the metaphor it was going for and the whole theme of the book I do like. I just can't really say I enjoyed my reading experience. It's just one of those that I do think about more positively after the fact, but I do know also that while I was reading it, I wasn't really vibing with it either. It's just a very bizarre fever dream book, which is typically my thing. But again, with so much poop mentioned and some shock value things that, again, I feel like were just more so for shock value, it just really took down the experience for me. So this one's a weird one because I liked it more after I was done with it, but I didn't necessarily love my reading experience either. So I don't know. This one's a weird one for me. I don't really know where I land with it, but the ending does stick with me. So yeah, I don't know. That's why this is the top of the forgettable list, because I did kind of forget about it, but I do also think it's kind of fine. I don't know. Next is the whatever/fine/good books. These had some redeeming qualities, but I still had a lot of criticisms of them, so they're just kind of middle of the road. The first being Shield of Sparrows. This was in a very recent vlog of mine, or is it in next week's vlog? I don't know. I don't know when this video is going to come out, but I read this very recently, and I have to say right away, the writing is not good. The writing is not good. It is so repetitive. It's exhausting to read sometimes. Again, this is another situation where the reader is left with nothing. The reader cannot have a question of their own or cannot think by themselves at all. Everything is completely just shoved to the reader multiple times. So the writing was not good. It needed to be edited so hard. Multiple additional pass-throughs should have gone through this book line by line, in my opinion. It needed to be way tightened up. It wasn't so bad that line by line wasn't bad, but it was the culmination of all these repetitive sentences and just so much needed to be cut out pretty much and tightened up. So the writing's not good, but I did still find myself somewhat enjoying this. I liked the story. This is a story that takes place in a fantasy world with monsters, and I love monsters and creatures within a fantasy world. And we follow our main character, Odessa, and her sister, her half-sister technically, is supposed to be the Sparrow. And this is the daughter of a king that gets married off to another territory to keep a peace treaty going. And so May, our main character's sister, was being prepped her whole life to be the Sparrow and also secretly to be a spy and an assassin on behalf of their dad. But the prince ends up coming alongside this man called the Guardian, who is this mysterious monster hunter type of character, and there's just a lot of mysticism surrounding him where he might have powers and people don't really know who he is, where he came from. He just goes by the Guardian, whatever. So the prince and the Guardian come to Odessa's castle, and they're like, you know what, actually, I don't want to marry May. I want to marry Odessa. So then Odessa ends up having to marry this prince and goes off to this other territory. And it's just the story of her being married off and learning more about this territory and learning more about the monsters, because it ends up coming to light that there is this disease, infection going through the monsters that this territory is trying to kind of keep under wraps and trying to figure out before it spreads across the entire kingdom. And yeah, that's like the setup. It's a fantasy romance, so romance ensues as well. And I did not like the romance once it was established either. So it makes it seem like I really didn't like this book. And it deserves any and all criticisms, quite frankly. But for whatever reason, I did find myself still somewhat enjoying this. So I think it was fine. I think it was good. It kept me entertained. It read faster. Like, it's a book that's over 500 pages. And again, it shouldn't be. It should be like a 400-page book. But despite the fact of how long it was, and despite the fact it was so repetitive, I still read it pretty fast and still mostly enjoyed my time. Some of the plotting at the end was a little bit strange to me. Some of the choices for like twists and whatever. But yeah, I'm very on the fence about reading the sequel or not. So I'm waiting to see what people tell me in the vlog of which I read that book, or in the comments of this video, whether or not I should read the sequel. If you are somebody who also just felt kind of like okay about this one, did you read the sequel? What'd you think about it? I don't know. I'm super on the fence, but this was okay. Then Lakewood by Megan Giddings. This was pretty disappointing for me, and it was just fine at the end. This had such a promising premise. We follow a main character named Lena. She is this young Black woman who is financially struggling because her mother and grandmother have a lot of medical debt. So because of this, she signs up for this very secretive and elusive research experimentation of some sort. And she goes in for this research, and it's just weird. It's just weird. Vibes are off. She's not really sure what's going on. And it's kind of psychological, but it just didn't lean into it enough for me. I also did expect this to be more body horror, more of like a body experimentation book, which it does lean more into like social experimentation, which I didn't mind. But then I wish it just did more psychology more, and we just like understood the inner workings of the character a little bit more. Instead, it just felt very veiled. I felt like very distant from what was even happening. And this also leans closer to Forgettable. I don't even know if I could remember how this ends. So I was just like very disappointed by this, because the back talks about it being commentary on like what happens to Black bodies in the medical field. And that is a huge special interest of mine, is medical experimentation in general, particularly how the Black population has suffered the most experimentation for the sake of everybody else, and continues to very much not receive treatment or care or diagnosis like they should, and how much medical myths and falsities are still following Black people in the healthcare system. So I just was really excited that this book was saying it was going to do some commentary on that, but I just didn't feel like it really did it. This is just another case of I wish it did more. I wish it leaned into what it was doing more and thought a little bit more outside of the box. And I feel like it just played it very safe. And because of that, it just felt much more uninteresting than what it promised to be. Heavenly Bodies by Imani Iru. This was another weird one, because I wasn't liking it for the first 100 pages, and then I really liked it for like another 100 pages, and then I didn't like the rest of the book. So this was a weird one in the middle of the road too. I just feel like this has an interesting world outside of what we've learned about. Like the whole world is based in zodiacs and celestial stars and all of that. And I really like the ideas and the foundation of that. We didn't really get to know super much. Like, we do, but I feel like there's still so much potential with this world that could possibly be expanded on in the rest of the series, because I do think this is supposed to be a trilogy. I know the sequel is out. I think they're still waiting on the third book. But this has an interesting world, and I did really like the banter for a minute between our love interest. But then again, once the relationship was established, I didn't really care anymore. I kind of lost interest. And then the plotting was a bit cliche as well, and the writing was a bit cliche overall. This is a story about a woman who is queen of her territory, but there was a star who is the god of war that ended up killing everybody in her castle, including her parents. So she ended up having to flee because him and her are connected by a prophecy that says she will fall in love with the king of war, or the god of war, and they will both die, or something like that. So he is hunting her down, and so she's running. And an enemy, like, the book opens up where an enemy territory of hers has captured her and takes her to enemy king. And he says, hey, a star is chasing you down, but I know you're super powerful, because I know that you are somebody in your territory that has all three of your territory's abilities, because each territory or kingdom or whatever the hell has 3 types of magics that the people in those areas can have. And there's special people once in a while that have and possess all 3 types of powers of their territory. She is one. So she is powerful, and it is known that she can not be killed by a star. So the king is like, hey, you're gonna help me kill a star. Like, I want to kill a god myself, and you're gonna help me do it because you have no other choice. And so she's like, okay. And then she gets trained by the king's son, and they go to a ball and they do some random cliche plot lines. There's romance involved, and shit hits the fan at the end. So much ends up happening at the end that I couldn't even confidently tell you everything that happened, because I feel like by the end I was pretty checked out. I was already thinking it was pretty mid, so I was starting to just get checked out each page, and by the end I was just finishing it to finish it, which isn't a good thing ever. So yeah, maybe this should be a little bit lower. This potentially should be a little bit lower. But whatever, we're gonna roll with it. I do think I'm more inclined to pick up the sequel to Shield of Sparrows over the sequel to Heavenly Bodies, but that could be recency biased as well. Even without the recency, just because of like the Monster Hunter aspect. I like the Monster Hunter aspect. If you guys know any fantasy romance books with Monster Hunter, kind of like almost like a Witcher fanfic, but like not a fanfic, you know what I'm saying? But like has the essence of a character that's like Geralt of Rivia. Drop them down below, let me know. Anyways, next is Miss March by Virginia Fido. This was one that I listened to on audiobook. I liked this, but again, it ended up just kind of falling into the mid territory. We follow a main character named Mrs. March, and she is the wife of an author. And he writes these like murder mystery thriller type of books, and she becomes convinced that he murdered somebody, I think. And she becomes so obsessed with this idea, and she just starts to spiral. It's like a stream of consciousness, so you just follow her thoughts throughout the day and the actions she decides to take. And this is more of an unhinged woman type of story. And I do think it was pretty good, and I did like the ending and where the spiraling took her. Like, the ultimate ending I think was really, really strong, but I do think this was slightly too long for what it was. And just because of how many other stories I have read of unhinged women, this one just didn't stand out comparatively to the rest that I've very dearly loved. But I do think this is a really, really solid book for somebody who wants to get into reading kind of stream of consciousness books following unhinged women. I think this is a great place to go for that. I think it's very approachable. It was like equally funny and disturbing. And yeah, this was good. This was a very, very solid, good book, but just comparatively to the other books I've read in a very similar genre and a very similar tone and approach, it doesn't stand out in that way, but it's solid. Then I have What Hunger by Catherine Dang. This was also an interesting one because this is another one where I feel like I liked it more after I finished the book and reflected on it more and talked about it more, because this was my first book that I read attempting to do some more spoiler-filled videos where I break down a full plot and talk about my thoughts along the way and all of that. This was the first book I did for that. So I do feel like having done that with this book, after going through the book a second time, is when I started to pick up more things and appreciate it a little bit more. This is largely marketed as a coming of age cannibal book, but I will say this is underwhelming for a cannibal book, but promising as a coming of age book. You know what I mean? This is a slow moving character study that ends up integrating some cannibalism in it. I do think that, I have a whole long ass spoiler filled video of me talking about this one, so you could check that out. But I do think that certain choices at the end felt clunky and shoehorned and was just trying to meet the unhinged cannibal story it was selling itself to be. But I do think that's the weakest aspect of this book, is the cannibalism. The strongest aspect of this book is following a young girl who, she's 14 in the story, and she is in a very transformative summer where she is about to start high school. Her older brother is about to go away to college. So this is a big summer for them, but tragedy strikes the family, and she ends up having to grapple with a lot of grief. And we see how that deteriorates her family and how her mother copes with that grief, how her father copes with that grief, what that does to the dynamic of the family. There is like another trauma that our character ends up facing that leads her on more of a revenge journey. And I liked all that. But then the cannibalism stuff felt very disjointed from the rest of the story. So I like it as a coming of age, slow burn tragedy and family study. But I don't like it as a cannibal book. You know what I mean? So there's that. Do with that what you will. What Hunger by Catherine Dang. Delicious Monsters by Lascelle Sambury. This was just, I had a little bit too much going on and was too long for me, but I do think it was a pretty okay YA horror. So we follow a young Black girl who is in a relationship with an older man. He's in college and she's in high school. I think she's 17. He's like 21, 22, something like that. And he unexpectedly breaks up with her, and she's kind of dealing with the turmoil of that. And then it comes to light that her mother, whose family she's never been in contact with, but her mother apparently had a family member who passed away. So they inherit the house and they're going to move to this house. And one very noteworthy thing to know about the main character is she can see ghosts. And we know right away that something ends up happening in the house that they inherit to lead to a case where there was a dead girl and a missing girl, I think. Something like that, where there's this mysterious case surrounding what ends up happening with our main character. So we get her perspective as her and her mother move into this house and stuff happens. And then we also get a perspective of a near future character. It's only like a few years after the fact, maybe 10 years or something. And her name's Brittany, and she runs a podcast that they talk about mysterious stories like that. And one of the cases she is going to talk about is the case of the main character. Daisy is her name. So we just kind of jump back and forth between these two characters and these two timelines. But I do feel like this book tried to do too much, and there was just like too many elements. And there was a certain moment, I think it was like halfway through the book, where it felt like a climactic moment, but obviously it wasn't. And the book kept going. And I just feel like this was just trying to do too much in a single book. This could be broken down into like 3 different books with how many things it was trying to do and how many themes it was going for. But I do think it was pretty solid, and I did have a good time listening to the audiobook for this one. The narrators did a fantastic job because it is done by 2 narrators for the 2 different POVs. I do think that the POVs were not super well balanced. There was like a moment halfway through the book-ish where we were getting like 60 pages of Daisy's story, and then we get like 2 pages of Brittany, and then like another 50 pages of Daisy, and then like 2 pages of Brittany. So I just felt like the balance was off. Oh, another thing in this book is both characters have a tumultuous, strained relationship with their mothers some way, somehow. So that's another thing going on in this story. There was just like a lot going on and a lot of elements, but I do think that the character work was pretty strong and it was an entertaining time. Then Mocha by Monica Kim. This is one that I very recently posted a full spoiler vlog with, so this one I will definitely keep brief. This is one where we follow two POVs, one being a man who has set up hidden cameras in his workplace to spy on the women going to the bathroom, and the other POV is a woman who ends up becoming victim to a Mocha scandal, that being a hidden camera scandal, and it ends up taking her down a journey of revenge. And it's very much sold as a revenge story. I do think it falls a little bit short on the revenge territory. And overall, I was just a bit underwhelmed with this one. There ended up being a supernatural aspect. And while I liked it, I don't think it was utilized enough in the story. And I just felt like the book ended up being a bit too jumbled. The plotting, there was way too many convenient plotting things. And the plotting was awkward at times to me as well. The pace of the story felt awkward at times. Yeah, I don't know. This was fine. It was fine. No One is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. This is a very experimental story. I applaud it immediately for its unique approach. This book is broken up into two parts. The whole story is told in vignettes, but the first part focuses on following a main character who is just like chronically online. And part one feels like you were scrolling social media and TikTok and whatever. It's just all these vignettes of the most dystopian and ridiculous sounding things, and it's making jokes about meme culture, and it's just equally ironic and satirical, and also has stuff to say about politics, and it just really brings in everything that you experience on a day-to-day basis, just being on a phone, being online, being on Instagram, Facebook, whatever, on any social media, just the bombardment of information, the bombardment of memes, and just all these different subcultures within the internet sphere. Part one focuses on. So in that way, part one is almost exhausting to read because it feels like you are doom scrolling. It really accomplishes that quite well. So while I appreciated part one and saw what it was doing, and it made me laugh sometimes, it made me agree other times, it made me confused sometimes that I didn't really know what it was talking about, I, applaud the uniqueness of it. Part two of the story completely shifts, and the main character finds out that her sister is pregnant with a child that will be incompatible with life for very long. The child has a defect, a mutation of some sort, so it will just ultimately eventually lead to the death of this child, but they are in a state that there's nothing that they can do about it, and the sister has to see through the pregnancy. And so it shifts the story where now we're following this family trying to come to terms with their situation, and once the baby is born, trying to enjoy what very limited time they have with this child, trying to see the beauty and the fun during this time, which is just so difficult because they just know the inevitability of everything. And it is so heartbreaking. I bawled my eyes out at the end of this. And it does end up where the child does die in the end, and then they have to deal with the funeral and all of that. None of that's unexpected because they know that this child's not going to make it through. So just know that. And it's so hard to read. There was just one scene in the hospital where a nurse made a comment, unleashed everything from me. Every ounce of water that was in my body came out of my eyeballs at that time. It's quite the experience to read because part one and part two feel like two completely different things, but that is kind of the point where we feel so embedded in online culture and social media, but that all comes to such a grinding stop when something in your real life happens that is tragic or whatever that requires all of your attention. Now, internet, social media, all of that means nothing, and it seems so pointless because it is so pointless, and it's just a cesspool, and that's kind of what the book is saying. And yeah, so you can't really have one extreme without the other because that's where that emotional impact really lies. And it kind of has you questioning, what is the point? how do I want to spend my time? Where do I want to put my energy? And that kind of thing. So it was an interesting experience because part one was exhausting, but also necessary to have packed the punch that part two did. You know what I mean? So I recommend this. I think it was a really solid book, but it was somewhat of a chore to get through the first part, but it's like a necessary evil. So overall, this was just a very unique reading experience. Now we're getting into my recommend to highly recommend stories. These are just really, really solid books that I either really have nothing bad to say about them other than they didn't change my brain chemistry, or I just have like a couple minor things, but otherwise 2 thumbs up, you know what I mean? So first one being Exiles by Mason Coyle. This is a quick one that I listened to the audiobook for, and it's a really solid sci-fi horror. We follow a small crew of 3 people. We are following the POV of the woman of the crew, and they are going to go to Mars because there's already a pre-built lab on Mars. There was 3 robots sent to get it set up for them. So they are going to go to Mars, kind of scope it out, do some research, and report on the possibility of potentially putting humans on Mars for like longer term living, that kind of situation. But when the crew gets to Mars, things are already wrong. The lab is already destroyed. Something has happened. A bot is missing. And the last 2 bots are acting very strange. So it becomes a situation where the crew is trying to figure out what's going on. And there is potentially this otherworldly being on the planet that has potentially caused this damage. And yeah, we'll leave it at that. I liked the voice of our main character. We did get a good amount of background story with her that I felt was strong and gave her more dimension, and I understood her motivations, and it added this level of internal personal conflict that she had to work through as well, and kind of why she was chosen for the mission and all of that. Her background, I did feel like added well to the story, and the atmosphere, I enjoyed this claustrophobic feel because they're in these suits. They can't inhale the atmosphere or else they will like instantly die. And this very creepy, unsettling, is there a being on here? The bots are being weird. Like you just like don't know what quite is going on. So you're there the whole time to figure it out. So I had a really solid time listening to this. I think it was really well done. I loved the way it ended. The very ending, I think, was so good, and just exactly how to end this and pack it with such a punch. It was a very powerful ending that I really, really loved and appreciated. And there was some pretty decent body horror without being like super gory, some good imagery. So really solid time. I don't really have bad things to say about this other than it didn't blow me out of the water, but really good. When the Wolf Comes Home by Nat Cassidy. This is quite a polarizing one because it is not what you expect. And that's either for better or for worse. But, you know, you can't say too much because it is best to go into this with as little information about it as possible, because that is part of the appeal of this book is you don't know what you're going to get until you're kind of figuring it out as you're going. But this book follows a young woman who is an aspiring actress, and she's waiting tables as she's struggling her way to find jobs as an actress. And one day she goes home and she ends up finding this little boy outside of her apartment who is terrified. And he seems to be running from someone. And as she is trying to console this little boy, there is an attack on her like neighbors. Like all hell breaks loose. There's arguments, and then something comes around and it gets very bloody, and there is a huge attack. And then the woman realizes that the boy is running from daddy, and him and her proceed to run together, and it's this story of them trying to run from daddy, and then a lot of weird stuff happens. And that's like all I can say. But this is a very inventive story. It has a lot of themes surrounding imagination. There's quite a bit of philosophical ponderings throughout this book too that I did appreciate, and it's just a little bit more of it's like hard-hitting and serious and blood-soaked, but also a little bit goofy zany and out of the box. It's a very interesting balance, and we end up getting introduced to some other POVs that we just slowly learn how they are integrated into the story. And I think that this was a really solid time. I will say one of the additional POVs we get, I don't think worked super well for me. And there were certain chapters that were just like very quick blips into a very, very random character that we never ever go back to. And I felt like that happened a little bit too often, and it pulled me out of the story a bit. And I don't know how I feel about the ending still. The ending is bleak, and I think it's a very brave ending choice to make. And I think people will feel very strongly about the ending choice. I think I mostly didn't like it, but I also like don't feel super married to that take either. So I don't know. I still feel about the ending. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about the ending, but I do think it was a very interesting time and very unique from what I've read. And there were a lot of references that I haven't like personally watched said references, but I understood them enough to know how they were tying in with the overall plot of the story and the overall story itself. So yeah, it was a solid time. It is the next day because I did not have the stamina to keep going yesterday. This video is probably so long. It's certainly not under an hour like I was hoping it would be, but let's just carry right on where I left off. Next book is Ashes of the Sun by Django Wexler. This is a high fantasy trilogy. This is the start of the trilogy in which we follow a brother and a sister who are on two sides of a conflicting world and government. They were separated from each other when they were young, so they haven't seen each other for a very long time. But the sister is working alongside this organization within the government. This book is very much inspired by Star Wars. So pretty much think of her being like part of the Jedi, but in this world it's called the Order, the Twilight Order, I believe is what its full name is. And then the brother is on the side of the rebellion. And we follow their two stories separate as she is training and going on her first journey and going on these missions within her organization. And on his side as he is fighting with the rebellion, and their paths eventually cross. And yeah, I don't really know what else to say about this to give you guys a synopsis. It's a fantasy, so there's a lot going on. There ends up being some journeying throughout the world. There ends up being introductions of all of these creatures and beings. The creature aspect is really interesting because the creatures themselves are just kind of these culminations of organic material. So they're just these fleshy globs, and I did really enjoy it. I didn't love the way it ended. I feel like a certain character should have been let go at the end of this book. There's a lot of characters, but I feel like one should have been let go. So I'm a little bit nervous to go into the second one because that particular character left a really bad taste in my mouth. So I don't know how I'm going to feel about them if they're throughout the rest of the series as well. But another criticism I had of it is there are some woman-woman relationships within the book, but the one that we follow, I didn't really love the way it was written because the author decided to make both of the young women very naive, and it just made them feel very immature and very, very young in those moments where, I mean, the book isn't spicy, it's fade to black scenes, but even the lead up just felt really awkward, and it made me a little bit uncomfortable because of how much younger they were reading during those particular moments. So that was just kind of, I just noticed that, and it did take me out of the story. But otherwise, I really liked this. I did compare it to Star Wars because it is inspired by Star Wars, but it does stand on its own, and it's not as sci-fi heavy as Star Wars is. But one thing that I like is there's some potential previously thought to be extinct beings in this world that may not be so extinct as they thought. And I think that that's a really interesting aspect to get more into in the coming books. Recently, I read Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a novella by Stephen Graham Jones. I really enjoyed this one. I think it was really, really solid. I went into it completely blind, so I had no idea what I was getting into, but we are following a group of friends, young friends, and one night they decide to pull a prank with a mannequin. And I'll just say the character we follow after this prank happens starts to get a little bit paranoid starts to spiral a little bit, and we don't really know if we can trust this narrator, and we don't really know what is really happening and what is potentially happening just within the narrator's head. But we are in the narrator's head as we follow his justifications for why he decides to do what he does throughout the rest of the novella, and I don't really want to say much more since it is so short. It was at some points kind of awkward to read just because the way it's written is like the narrator would be speaking. So it was sometimes hard to fully connect with the writing, or like not fully connect with it, but sometimes I'd have to reread things. But I feel like that's just kind of par for the course with Stephen Graham Jones in general. But it definitely caught me off guard. Like I didn't really expect where it ended up going. Like really throughout the whole book, like I just didn't expect the whole POV and what this character would be thinking the whole way through. So it was really engaging in that way because I found it to be really unique and also somewhat heartbreaking at its core. Like if you really think about what was going on, it is really also kind of sad, but it's not sad like you're gonna cry, but it's like psychologically sad, you know what I mean? So I enjoyed that one. I thought it was really great. Flowers from the Void by Gianni Washington. This is my only short story collection I have completely finished so far this year. I'm in the middle of 2 technically, but this is the only one I've so far completed. This was such a solid short story collection. The like worstly rated story in the book was 3 stars. Everything else was like 4, 4.5, and 5 stars. I thought this was such a fantastic collection, and Gianni Washington has such a beautiful prose. It's pretty flowery, but I really loved it. I really connected with her writing style. I thought it was great. And I think every story had something really unique to offer the reader. And it was very variable. Like there was a lot going on. There was a story with witches. There was a story following death in a bar. There was a story about a young boy being pulled into a very toxic physically abusive relationship. There was a young girl who ends up creating a relationship with her shadow. It's very interesting. There was like some magical realism-ish within there, some psychological horror, and also some fantastical bits as well. And I think it just really did a great job of not only following a multitude of different main characters. We had young characters, like children characters, older characters, teenagers. Like we followed every type of character, white, black, queer, not queer. Every type of character was involved in this short story collection. So I really loved the variety of not only the stories, but of the characters themselves. My favorite story was called Under Your Skin. It has themes surrounding what we give up of ourselves when we get into relationships, and it's taken quite literal in this world. And then my second favorite was called When I Cry, It's Somebody Else's Blood. And in that story, we follow the POV of this like ambiguous alien-esque creature who is obsessed with human eyeballs and is just kind of watching the villagers. And I loved the way that was written. That was a really fun POV to read from, and I liked where the story went. So I love this collection. I think it's really, really solid, and I highly recommend it. The next book is Helpmeet. This is a super short book. I think it's only about 85 pages, and it is taking place in the 19th century, and we follow a woman whose husband has succumbed to a mysterious medical condition, and he is pretty much rotting away, and she is trying to take care of him. So I thought that this was a really well done story. I think the ending is going to be very make or break for people. I think the ending itself will lose a lot of people because it gets very, very weird at the end. Had this really unique atmosphere. It was very gothic, unnerving, but not in your face unnerving. It was very subtle. And I just thought that this story at its core was so heartwarming in showing what this woman, like the woman of this story, cares so much about her husband despite his faults. And it really just had a lot to say about that unconditional devotion that this woman had. And I really liked the conversations around how her psychology, because she was a nurse before she had took him in and was like taking care of him. So she has background knowledge of medical stuff. He was actually a surgeon. That's how they met. So there's a lot of medical stuff for one. There's a lot of like body horror with medical things and festering wounds and all of that, which I really, really liked. But so she has this internal split of herself where she is the wife of this husband, but also the nurse of this husband, and kind of how she internally deals with that and how that manifests. All like the emotional stuff that comes with being a caretaker to somebody who you love. And it's like a personal connection and not just a patient in a hospital or whatever. But yeah, then the ending is so weird, but I loved it. I loved the way it ended. It lost me a little bit. I think that there was some surreal stuff going on that I think I didn't totally understand, that if it was like symbolizing something. I feel like there was some symbolism and metaphors that I wasn't fully picking up, and some of the ending imagery got away from me, but overall I did really like this. But it is a weird one, so I can definitely see how a lot of people wouldn't like this one, but it worked for me. Next is This a Cry for Help by Emily Austen. This was my first Emily Austen book, and I was really excited to pick it up. I actually got it from the library, and this book is about libraries. Well, we follow a librarian, and we open the story where she has very recently started going back to work after having left because she had a mental breakdown after finding out that her last relationship, her ex-boyfriend, passed away. And she kind of has a lot of guilt and just holds on to a lot of guilt of the fact that they did break up, because they broke up because she realized she was a lesbian. And it's just about her coming to terms with that. And we follow some of the backstory of her finding out she was a lesbian. And when we open the book, she is married with a wife. So it just kind of is her reflecting on that and the complex relationships that came out of her realizing she was a lesbian and how that made her see her past relationships different. But she does work at a library, so that comes into the story a lot. And this book and the story is a big kind of call to action on libraries, on what you can do with libraries, how important they are, how much they provide the community. And we just see that in the story. We watch as her main character does a bunch of community outreach and has to go to city halls and hears about people wanting to ban books. And there's a lot of themes and commentary around what banning books means. And it was a really interesting, eye-opening book. I think this is just a really important story for generations to come, to kind of remind ourselves what libraries provide and how important they are. So I did really enjoy this one. I thought it was a really solid time. It didn't, blow me away. I don't have anything negative to say other than I didn't immensely connect with it enough that it was like a 5-star read for me, but highly recommend it. I think it was really great. I'm excited to check out her other works that I think I will connect with more, just based on what the characters go through and the themes of some of her other works and stuff like that, but still a really solid book. Next was actually a reread for me, and that was Together We Wrap by Skyla Arndt. This is actually a YA horror, but I think it's so solid. It is a YA horror in which we follow two main characters. It is split POV, Will and Elwood. And Elwood's family is actually in charge of a church. Like, his dad is the preacher of this small town's church, which is very culty. And Will actually believes that his family is responsible for her mother's disappearance, and she is very much still determined to figure out what happened with her mother. But then one day, Elwood overhears a conversation that his dad is having, that his family is having, and he realizes he needs to get away. He has been very abused and manipulated within his family, and he is opening his eyes to that. Him and Will end up teaming up to figure out what exactly is going on with the church/cult and what Elwood's place is in that. And Will still wants to find out more about her mother, so she also wants to try to find more evidence that Elwood's family is responsible for her mother's disappearance. And it's kind of a ragtag group of people that end up getting together, these kids, as they further find things out about the town and the church and the connections of all of that. There is a lot of planty horror, a lot of bug horror. It's very like dark, whimsical fairy tale horror in my eyes. And the way this ends, I really, really love. There is I was going to say subplot romance, but it's pretty integral to the plot, but it doesn't feel like it's a romance book. Like, the romance still feels somewhat secondary. It's just like not the main focus, but there's a romance in this book that I feel like is so sweet. And the ending is beautiful, yet also heartbreaking. And I was just really impressed by the story. Obviously, I reread it, and I think the writing's really solid. And this is just overall a very, very solid YA horror. As somebody who doesn't really love YA horror, this one worked really well for me. And particularly if you like culty, buggy horror, go for this one. Crypt of the Moon Spider by Nathan Ballingrad. This is another short story. I read a lot of novellas in May and June, mostly in May because I was participating in a readathon. So I read this in May too. And this is a really interesting sci-fi, gothic, medical horror. So it takes place in 1930 something, but it's in kind of alternate history where there is actually a mental institution on the moon. So we open the story where we are following our main character, who is a wife that is experiencing melancholy and ideations of taking her own life. So her husband sends her to the mental asylum on the moon, and she quickly starts to realize that there is much more sinister things happening on the moon with the doctor in charge, and it has this kind of mad scientist aspect and all of this medical horror, and there's a lot of spiders involved in the story, so it's also very buggy. And I just had a really good time with this. You get to learn some backstories of some of the characters, and I think it was very beautifully written. My biggest complaint is it was so short, and I honestly could have done a full-length novel for this one. I just really loved that atmosphere and the tone of the story. It reminded me very much of a book I'm going to talk about very soon, Leech by Hiran Ennis, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. But those two stories are very, very similar atmospherically. It's another one that's a little bit weird though too, I would say. Then we have The Har by David Sodergren. I read this very, very recently, and I thought this was really solid. I didn't love it as much as I feel like a lot of other people love it, but I thought it was really good. It's a very simplistic writing approach, so it's very approachable, and it just very much is good versus evil, but you are very clearly rooting for certain people and very clearly rooting for certain people's downfall in this story. In the story, we follow an 84-year-old woman named Muriel. She lives on a Scottish island that has been slowly overtaken by this billionaire that keeps buying up people's properties in order to build a large golf course. But Muriel is stubborn and she will not give up her house, so she ends up pretty much being harassed by everybody, by this billionaire, by the construction workers, by the project managers, by anybody involved in the development process. She's being harassed by them. But one day she ends up finding a washed up sea creature on the shore, and she takes the sea creature in to kind of take care of it and get it back to health. And that's really where the story takes off, and it gets pretty strange from there. It's very bloody, very gory. There's a lot of violence against old people in the story, which was gut-wrenching to read sometimes, and it's pretty descriptive in that blood and brutality, so be aware of that. But I thought it was a very charming read. It was very heartwarming at the center, and it follows a lot of Muriel's grief with her husband and kind of how that manifests, and I really liked the way it ended. I thought it ended on a very beautiful note. And that's it. I don't have, again, much bad to say about this other than it just didn't leave too much more for me to process, and it just didn't have a type of prose that I love, but I think it was still really good, obviously. Then we have Leech by Hiran Ennis. So this is also very similar to me as Crypt of the Moon Spider, not in plot, but in atmosphere, because this takes place in an undisclosed time period, but it's interesting because it feels both Victorian era but also futuristic, because the book talks about having had centuries of a bunch of apocalyptic events happening. So the atmosphere of the world itself is a very unique blend. But in the story, we are following the POV of a doctor who is part of this hive mind. They are part of the Institute, which is just a organization that has all of the doctors of this world, but they are all part of the same consciousness. So it's like kind of hard to explain, but that's the best I can do with that. But we follow a doctor as they go to this estate in which the previous doctor from the institute died. So the new doctor has to go investigate, figure out what happened with the previous doctor, and replace that doctor. And this ends up leading the doctor to find a parasite that has broken out of a cave system within this city and has started to kind of spread, and further mystery on where this parasite came from, what it's doing to people, how to stop it, blah, 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 blah. I thought this was really, really interesting as well. Again, super unique atmosphere, very gothic, horror, sci-fi. And I will say there ends up being a plot line by the end that is a revenge plot line that is rooted in some very, very hard to read, very described essay instances. So be aware of that, because I was not aware that that would end up being a subplot of the story, but it very much was. But I did enjoy this overall, and the imagery and the atmosphere was very good. I will say the writing style, though, the first chapter is so incredibly pretentious. I promise it gets better after, but it took me a little bit to get into the writing style. The writing style is not approachable. Plus, there is a made-up dialect within this world, or a made-up language within this world, that only happens when the main character is talking to certain people that use that language. But there's no, like, translation or anything like that. You really just have to use context clues to figure out what the conversations they were having were. So that was a little bit challenging as well. And I did think that the ending dragged a little bit. I did think that the ending dragged a little bit and got too long, and I think it could have been tightened up a little bit more at the end. But otherwise, I did really like the parasite of it all, the hive mind stuff where our main character starts to kind of lose connection to that whole consciousness and starts to have to grapple with having their own thoughts and not hearing the thoughts and seeing everything that the other doctors around the world are also seeing. But I liked the background of the institute. You don't get a bunch, but you get enough that you can draw your conclusions where necessary on how the institute kind of came to be somewhat. And there's some creatures and stuff too, but I do think that the background of the world was a little less clear. If you need a book that's like isolated winter setting, this is a good one for winter. Spread Me by Sarah Gailey. I talked about this in my mid-year wrap-up, but this is a book that is following a main character who has a sexual desire and is sexually aroused by viruses. One day, her and her research team, they are out in the middle of the desert. They find an unknown specimen outside, and for whatever reason, she feels so drawn towards this specimen that she decides to break all protocol and bring it directly into their labs, and stuff starts popping off from there. It's very psychological. It's a very psychological read. I think it did what it wanted to do very well. It is a weird one though, because like I said, the main character is sexually aroused by viruses. So this is a very strange one. It's very erotic horror, but in a kind of lustful, sensual way, not so much in an aggressive way, at least in my head. That's how it read. The tone of the sexual stuff was not necessarily as aggressive as I would say like a smut scene is or something like that. You know what I mean? It just read a little different, maybe just for me, but I really enjoyed the body gore, like the body imagery of this and the body horror of this story. And again, the psychological stuff was very effective for me, but it's one of those that it's like, you either like it or you don't. It's a weird, sexy book. So it is multiple hours later. This video is officially going to be the death of me. My wireless mic died, so I'm using my other mic, so hopefully the sound's not crazy different. Anyways, let's truck on along. Next book is Siren and Scion by J.D. Evans. This is part of a ongoing fantasy romance series. It is currently an unfinished series, but this is self-published. And the first one is called Reign and Ruin. Each book follows a different couple within this fantasy world, and in this world there are mages. They're kind of elemental. They're just like, there's just people with magic. And like I said, each book follows a different set of characters. This one follows a water mage named Amara, but Amara gets tasked by one of the main characters that we meet in the first book. She is the princess that is going to ascend to the to the throne to be the queen, but she is tasked by her to go to this particular territory in order to try to find mages of a particular house that are believed to potentially not exist anymore. So Amara is tasked to go there to find some of these mages. And yeah, I don't really know what else to say about it because this is the third book in this series, but I really, really loved not only Amara as the main character, she is just such a strong, independent, powerful, confident woman. She is one of the most powerful water mages, so she's actually called a Chara, and that is one of the missions of the queen, is she wants to find the Chara of each house, of each mage house. So Amara is that, but she has a lot of internal conflicts with her magic, and she really doesn't like to use it, and she has a lot of trauma behind that, and she's just such a complex, well-formed, dimensional, fully thought out character, and I love her so much. And then I really enjoyed the love interest of this particular book. I really enjoyed their dynamic, and J.D. Evans in general. I'm just really loving her fantasy romance stories because not only are the characters amazing on their own, particularly the women, she writes strong and powerful women so well. But what I really love most is the relationships, like the partners are very much there to support these already strong, powerful women, and there's just so much mutual respect within each couple, and yet they still all have such a individualized dynamic, and each couple stands on its own with such good characters. Like, the character work is so good, but I'm also just so fascinated by the world, and I really loved this particular installment because it really expanded my understanding of the world and really opened up a lot of room for further political conflict and further world building, quite literally, like geographically, because she goes to a completely different area than we've ever been to. So the map is expanding, the politics are expanding, the characters are expanding, and I really just love this series. So I ate this one up. I was kicking my feet giggling. I gave it a 4.5 star. The only reason it didn't get a full 5-star for me, a couple of plotting choices near the end that just didn't really make sense to me, because a character makes a certain choice that seems like it should be like a big deal, but it ended up just kind of being a dumb choice that didn't make a difference, and I didn't really know why he made that decision, and it didn't add anything or push the narrative forward. If anything, it kind of took me out of it. And then the ending felt a little bit dragged as well. So there's just like two tiny little things that kind of took me out of the story, but otherwise really, really great read. Highly recommend this series in general. This is my probably my second favorite. It's really, really high up there with the first book. The first and the third book are definitely my favorite of the series so far. Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This is a YA fantasy, so I was really surprised how much I did like this, but this is following our main character Laszlo Strange, and he is a character whose head is just in the clouds. He loves mysticism, he loves fables, he loves stories and fairy tales and just imaginative stuff. And then he kind of gets taken under the wing of one of the librarians. One of the legends that Laszlo is particularly interested in is the legend of this lost city that now people call Weep, but it used to be called something else. And he remembers the day that he forgot what the original name was, but it seems like magic must have been involved. He has been just borderline obsessed with finding out anything he can about this mysterious city. One day a warrior comes to town and he is requesting the help of some of the academics in order to take them back to this lost city because they have a problem that they need help fixing. And Laszlo ends up figuring out a way to be part of that group to then traverse back to the lost city. This is just a really fun time, but it's really dark as well. We get his POV as well as another POV of a blue girl, and we just kind of slowly learn how they are connected, and we slowly see their paths cross. And this book has a lot about gods and asks a lot of philosophical questions around who are the people we call gods. Are they always benevolent, or is there instances where they take advantage of their power over other people and power dynamics? The tiniest little criticism I have of it is in the beginning, there was like a comical amount of similes, but it did end up cooling off, and the writing itself is lovely outside of the fact that there were a little too many similes in the beginning, but it lightens up, and overall the writing is very good. And what I do really applaud Laini Taylor for is not only her writing, but because it is a YA, I like extra applaud the fact that she really trusted the reader to use context and didn't feel like she needed to force like the reader to ask those philosophical questions, and they came up very organically and naturally, which is what the characters were experiencing. And Laini Taylor really just trusted the reader to come to those conclusions by themselves, which is just like, again, another just breath of fresh air, because I feel like lately I've read a lot of books that just do not trust the reader and do not allow the reader to think a single thought with just context. And that's just like one of my biggest pet peeves with writing and literature in general, is like I don't want to be spoon-fed everything and every thought. So I really loved that, and the fact it is a YA and still trusted the reader, I just like highly applaud. Now we are getting into the top of the top, and this is the amazing category. These have almost no notes minus the first one. These are so far my favorite books that I've read this year, and not even all of these technically have 5 stars, but retrospectively, these have really stood out to me, and upon ranking them, I think fondly back to these books more than the ones underneath them. So the first one being But Won't I Miss Me by Tiffany Sao. This is a motherhood alternate reality sci-fi story with a little tiny skosh of horror in it. So in this world, women who are pregnant not only give birth to the baby, but then they also give birth to an identical self. And the new self, the new mom, will eat the old mom. And this new mom is imbued with strength and unlimited energy and all of these abilities that postpartum women wish that they had to make the postpartum experience easier. These new moms in this world have that. But we follow a main character, Vivian, whose rebirth goes wrong, and she does not come out of birth stronger, and she actually feels much weaker. And I really loved the overall metaphor of this rebirth process when you become a mother, because that's very much the actual case, both physically, emotionally, psychologically. You become a completely different person the second you give birth. So I really like how physically that was manifested and how literally that was shown within this world. I also really liked the backdrop. The backdrop is like an alternate reality where a huge environmental crisis had happened. So the world has a completely new electricity grid, and I just liked all those like tiny added details to that, because it just gave another level to the story and didn't make it just about motherhood. So it wasn't one note. It also had this environmental crisis stuff happening that really livened up the world and put our character in certain situations. Like her job had to do with manipulating appliances to work with the new electricity grid. So it added to our character's overall experience and the reader's experience. And then there's also a big thing with culture in this story, and it ended up being so twisty. It really took me off guard. I did not expect the directions that the book was gonna go, and I just had a really great time. I will say the writing wasn't always amazing, but the experience of reading it was, and I really think back on this book so fondly, and I really think it was such a unique experience for me, and loved everything it had to offer. Woo Woo by Ella Baxter. Now, this is a book that I loved, but I don't think most people will. It's a very esoteric book in which we follow a main character, Sabine, and she is a successful artist, and she is getting ready for her next exhibition, and it's really mostly just a character study of her, and she is a very complex character, very dimensional. As she gets closer to her exhibition, she starts to get more and more unpredictable and more and more self-absorbed and also potentially starts hallucinating, and she believes that there is a stalker watching her. Now, I love this book, but you're following a pretty unlikable character. She has quite a bit of toxic traits, particularly with her husband, Constantine. He is so sweet, and there's such a tender relationship between the two of them, but she does stuff to kind of purposely try to get a reaction and poke at him, and she could be very self-destructive in a lot of ways. And the way he approaches that, it just really felt like to be known is to be loved, to be seen is to be loved. Like, he just really knew her heart, and it was just so sweet. But that is just like one element of the story. We are also following Sabine as she does some bizarre art experiments and stuff like that, and there's a lot of kind of joking at and being satirical, almost like expose-ish of the art scene and kind of making fun of its pretentiousness, but in like a self-aware way where I'm making fun of this, but I'm also part of it. So it's done with love. We're laughing at it with love. So it's kind of like a love letter / expose of the art scene, the pretentiousness of that, and just of artists and how eccentric and wacky they sometimes can be. And that just is what Sabine is. So this is largely a character study. The stalker thing, like, don't expect it to take on this like thriller feel with the stalker aspect. It's much more of kind of a psychological thing where there were actually genuinely super creepy moments that were super effective for me, but then also I was laughing. Like, it's funny, it put me on edge, and it was also profound a lot of the time. Each chapter is headed with a title of a piece of art. So each chapter I was Googling the art piece it was headed with. So I ended up getting exposed to a lot more art, which I'm not somebody who is like embedded in the art scene, so I didn't know how I would feel about this book, but I loved New Animal by Ella Baxter, so I had to check this one out, and I loved this one, but it doesn't have very great ratings, but I thought it was great. I really enjoyed it for what it is, and I just love Ella Baxter's writing. She is officially one of my all-time favorite writers, and I just really hope she continues to create stories. Blood Over Bright Haven by M.L. Wong. This was so good. Here's the thing, it's pretty on the nose in terms of what it's saying and the commentary and the social commentary. It's very on the nose with that, but it's so poignant and so well done and so well crafted, because not only is the social commentary so well done, but it's still built on this really unique fantasy world. Hold on, let me put a light on because I am losing sunlight. Okay, is that better? This video is such a mess. I have like so many jump clips because my batteries kept dying, my camera was overheating. I'm on day 2, 5 hours in, changing the light. This video is something, okay? This video is the death of me. Anyways, Blood Over Bright Haven. In the story, we're following our main character, Sayana, and she is going to test to become part of the High Magistry, and she would be the first ever woman admitted into the High Magistry and allowed to study magic through the university. Very early on, she passes that test and is allowed to study at university, but because she is the first woman to do so, she is not treated very well. And as like a joke, they end up giving her a janitor as an assistant. And her and Tamil end up getting to know each other very well. Tamil is actually somebody who, in the very beginning of the book, him and his community were trying to cross this very treacherous area surrounding the city. So the city is kind of in this bubble, and outside of this bubble is what they called like the wilds, and in the wilds is what is called the blight, and it is pretty much just this bright light that will completely incinerate any organic material, so people. So in the very beginning, Tamil and his community are trying to pass this like very treacherous area surrounding the city in order to get into the city and live there as refugees. And Tamil is one of the very few people that does make it past and into the city. So he is living in this main city as a refugee. So there is a lot of commentary around how refugees are treated, and him and his people are seen very, very much as second-class citizens, are treated extremely poorly, are not given resources like they should be given, and experience overall a lot of racism and hatred. Now, Sayana is a very complex character too. In the beginning of the book, she is very much self-absorbed. She only understands her own problems and cannot understand any other type of issue that any other person would have. And she's very, very, very ignorant. And she is so incredibly frustrating to read for a lot of the book. It does change though as her and Tamil's relationship develops in terms of them just like getting to know each other because of their circumstances. They're being forced to work together. She starts to learn a lot more about Tamil and his people and what they've been experiencing and stuff like that. So it does turn around, but she is so frustrating to read for a while. But then it kind of turns into them finding out some corruption and secrets of the city and trying to work together to do something about it. And yeah, I just really thought this was so well done, so emotional, but the magic is very almost industrial steampunk-ish in a way. The magic is literally you have to type into a typewriter, do a bunch of stuff, and like that's what she does, is she kind of codes magical spells. And the magic system is just so interesting, so incredibly unique. I've never read anything like that, and you really get to learn a lot about it, which I love. And that is not something that if I were pitched that this is like an industrial steampunk fantasy story, I would not be like, oh, that sounds like up my alley. But it just worked really well. I think everything was just so well described and explained and so fleshed out that it was really easy to feel embedded into the story. And yeah, the character arcs were great, and I did like the way it ended. It did get a little knock from me because the book kind of started to tease something between two characters, and I didn't even like that we were teasing about that. It doesn't end up going there, but I didn't even like that that was being a potentially teased at, you know what I mean? And I can't really say exactly what without a spoiler, but that's like my tiniest little criticism of it, is it was teasing a dynamic that had it fully done that dynamic I would have hated. But the fact that it even teased it kind of icked me out a little bit too. But otherwise, really great book. Once There Were Wolves by Charlotte McConaughey. This is kind of like, how do you even describe, it's kind of like a drama, suspenseful, literary fiction, I guess. So we are following a main character who works as a nature conservationalist, a nature conservationalist, and she specifically is working with this pack of wolves as her and her team are trying to reintroduce wolves to this Scottish village, and the people of this village are not stoked about it. And so we follow our main character as she kind of reluctantly ends up forming relationships and connections with the townspeople. Again, reluctantly, because she's an interesting character in terms of she's very cold and she holds people at a distance, and she does not want to open herself to emotion. She has a twin sister that is living with her that her twin sister had experienced something, which you do later find out in the book, but she had experienced something that really led to her having very variable days. Some days she will be happy as a clam, cleaning the house, whatever. Other days she will be almost catatonic and does not speak and barely responds and is very highly depressive on certain days. It's hard to describe this book, but it kind of is just a lot of things happening to people. We go back and forth between the current timeline and then learning more about our main character's experience growing up with her divorced parents and what happened to her sister, and the main character ends up kind of developing a relationship and where that leads, and then there's a murder. There's just like so much happening in the story that I didn't expect. But the emotional depth of this book, like, it's so interesting because Charlotte McConaughey's writing style is very simplistic. Not to say it's juvenile or whatever. Every word she uses is so purposeful, and she doesn't have a lot of filler words or a lot of filler ponderings. It's very straightforward writing, but somehow she is able to embed so much emotion in what she is writing. And I felt so many different emotions while I was reading this. And just the complexity of messy characters and messy dynamics and town drama, but in such a like, it's not just like teen drama, like Gossip Girl drama. It is like serious drama. Like, we're talking about a murder, you know what I mean? There's some seriously deeply rooted angers and resentments and relationships and all of this that she and our main character ends up kind of being tangled up in. Yeah, it was just a really interesting reading experience because it's one of those that I don't know how much I realized how much it was pulling me in while I was reading it, but by the end I was bawling my eyes out. I felt so much for all of these characters, and overall it was just very like luring. It just like lured me into the story without me even realizing it. It was almost like hypnotic in a way. It's a very strange one to describe, but it gets very dark. It gets so much darker than I expected. There's so many dark experiences that these characters face and get through, and yeah, the ending was such a mixed experience in terms of it was so heartbreaking but also beautiful and hopeful. But I found that the character arc of the main character was so amazing. Like, she was a completely different person, I feel like, by the end of the story, because she eventually learns how to let people in. And I think a lot of the story has to talk about how important those connections are and how important it is to connect and talk with people. And despite the ugliness that can happen, there's so much beauty that can come out of those connections. And it all also ties into wildlife and our natural instincts and us either going with or going against those natural instincts, and how that could have certain ramifications that we can't necessarily predict and all of that. So I don't know, this one's a hard one to describe, but I just got completely sucked into the story and I loved it. Blood on Her Tongue by Johanna Van Veen. So I loved this, but here's the thing, it's a historical horror, but like, if you're somebody who wants your historical stuff to be like super accurate, I mean, maybe not this one. How the characters speak is definitely not historically accurate. I didn't mind that this isn't actually, like, it just doesn't feel as historical within the context of how the characters are talking, but the setting for me felt historical enough. I loved the characters and the relationships and the dynamics. So we're following our main character Lucy, and she has a twin named Sarah, and in the very beginning of the book she gets very concerning letters from Sarah, who is ill. She is ill, and leading up to her getting sick, she, or I guess her estate, had found a bog body on her land. Well, I guess on her husband's land technically, but on the land that she lives on, and she becomes increasingly obsessed with this bog body, and she eventually gets ill. So Lucy has to go out to her sister's estate to kind of check in on her and help and all of that. And I loved this. I love this sister relationship, and there's some drama in this story, some revelations that are wild, that took me by surprise. People sell it as a vampire book, and even Johanna Van Veen gets a question at the end of the book. One of her interview questions, she talks about vampires. And while it like kind of is a vampire book, it's like very unique. So don't expect really a vampire book. It's like vampire adjacent in my head. But I loved what it was that it did. And for me, it was also very unique. I hadn't really read something like that before. So I loved that, and it has a kind of very psychological effect that I enjoyed, and I really liked that there's multiple characters that are in the medical field, so we got a lot of historical medical stuff, which I love, and there's some pretty wicked body horror in this. It gets so bloody by the end, and I lived for it. I loved it so much, and for me, this was just a very exciting read. Like, it was just very propulsive and very page turner for me, and I don't have many books that I feel that ecstatic about, I feel like, but I was just eating this whole story up, really. And again, of course, you can hear more of my thoughts on these books in vlogs, because I'm trying to keep it a little bit quicker now, because I know I have not been speed running. But the next book is Night's Edge by Liz Kieran. This actually is another vampire book, and this is more traditional vampire, kind of. There's still a lot of unique spin to it, but this is closer to typical vampire. But we follow our main character, Mia, and her mother was turned into a vampire when she was 8, and it really ties together a emotionally abusive, manipulative, kind of narcissistic parent relationship, and has that run very parallel with the vampirism of this story. So I really loved how the vampire stuff was both a metaphor and a symbol, but also literal in this situation. But I loved how much that coexisted with the themes that the author was going for. It follows Mia as she is taking care of her mother and what she does for her mother, who is a vampire, and how they kind of get around that in society, because it's like outlawed to be a vampire. Technically, when you're a vampire, you're supposed to kind of self-report and go to these facilities that they say are treatment facilities, but a lot of the vampires are very, untrusting of that. So they are trying to keep it a secret that her mom is a vampire. So kind of how they navigate that, and Mia's place in that and her responsibility within it. And it's just very much about their dynamic, and starts to follow Mia as she realizes the toxicity that their relationship has, and her trying to separate herself and become an individual person and figure out what she wants and what she needs, and where that kind of takes her. So I loved this so much. I talk about this book a lot, but I really relate to Mia as a character. The mother-daughter dynamic, it just really resonated with me. The Need by Helen Phillips. I've talked about this so much, so this one I'm definitely going to keep brief. This, I love this story so much. So I listened to the audiobook. Audiobook is fan-freaking-tastic. I cannot wait to reread it physically, though. This follows a woman named Molly, and she is a paleobotanist, and she is a postpartum mother. She has, I believe the son is like 8 or 10 months old, and she has a 4-year-old. And the book opens up where it is a weekend that the dad is out of town, and Molly is feeling quite a bit overwhelmed taking care of the 2 kids by herself, and she becomes increasingly paranoid as she believes that there is an intruder in the house, and she goes to confront this intruder. And I'm just going to leave it at that. And then the story gets so incredibly twisty. And I just loved the writing style. This is a very literary story. There is a lot to be interpreted. There's a lot of reading between the lines. There's a lot of making your own connections. To me, this was a story, a big metaphor about postpartum anxiety. This is one of those books that is really hard to put into a box. It does not really belong to any one particular genre. It's kind of a blend of like a sci-fi, suspense, literary horror in a lot of ways. It's very psychological. To me, this was like psychologically terrifying to think about being in this potential situation that Molly finds herself in, but the writing just hit me so hard. The writing is so punchy. This is a very quick read, but another author who is able to do so much with so little words. She just thinks to say things slightly different than what would be like the cliche or the typical way of saying something, and I just really appreciate how much Helen Phillips is able to make small tweaks to sentences to just make it more interesting, for me at least as a reader. So I loved the writing style, the punchiness of the story, the twistiness of the story, and I was laughing. Some of the stuff that the little girl says is so funny to me, but I was also terrified. Like, again, on that psychological level, I was terrified. And the ending The ending is so bleak and so heartbreaking. So know that. The ending is incredibly bleak and I could see it pissing people off. Again, I feel like this was a big metaphor for postpartum anxiety, so it only made sense to me. The book, I will say, is pretty confusing at times. I mean, I was able to still keep up with everything, but it is one that you kind of have to pay attention to because it can very easily be confusing because, again, it's so punchy that stuff can happen so quick and new stuff is already happening that you can completely miss a couple things. And I ate it up. I love the metaphors, love the writing. I cannot wait to read more from Helen Phillips. Okay, and then the last two. I talked about both of these in my mid-year wrap-up, so I'm going to keep these super brief too. The next one is The Mountain in the Sea by Ray Naylor. Love this so much. This is such an approachable sci-fi book. I recommend this book to anybody, to any type of reader. If you're somebody who wants to maybe dip your toes into sci-fi, I think this is a great place to start. This is a very earthbound sci-fi in which we follow a group of researchers who have discovered a octopus that functions very differently than how they have known octopi to function previously. So they want to study this octopus and they attempt to make contact and communicate with this octopus. And I love that so much. But there's also multiple POVs and multiple characters that you follow that are dealing with various degrees of corporate corruption. There's a lot of AI use in this book in terms of how AI has shaped this alternate reality and the ramifications of that and the effects of that, whether good or bad, you'll find out. But this book was such a page turner. It felt so suspenseful to me and I was invested in every single aspect of this book. It also read very philosophical to me and made you ask a lot and think a lot about community and what it means to connect with other people and how necessary that is, and asks, what it means to be human, because there are, I guess you'd call them like cyborgs, like there's AI people. I don't really know quite how to describe him, but he's involved in the story, so that comes up. And this was just a really, really well done book. And I just really think this is a great book for any type of reader. And then the last one, the top of my list right now, is A Touch of Jen by Beth Morgan. Again, this is a very esoteric one, another one I've talked about a lot recently. This is a very strange character study. You're following unlikable characters, Remy and Alicia. They are a couple and they are obsessed with this girl named Jen who Remy used to work with, and they stalk her on Instagram, and Alicia has a Jen voice that she puts on and they just talk about her nonstop. They are just obsessed with Jen. One day they unexpectedly run into her and she actually invites them to come on a weekend surfing trip with her and her friends and her boyfriend, and they go, and most of the book is just character study, watching and observing these very awkward and unlikable and strange characters interact. Like Remy and Alicia have such a interesting and strange and sometimes warped way to look at the world and how they interact with people. Remy in particular, he is so obnoxious. He's one of those people that needs to be right all the time or just more right than the other person. He's like a contrarian, that type of vibe. He sucks, but he was so interesting to follow and follow what they think about as they're interacting with people and how awkward it is. And I loved just following these characters, and it's just a lot of character interaction, dialogue heavy, whatever. And then the end takes a complete left turn. The end of this book is so wacko bizarre horror and it leans so much into that, and I loved the fuck out of it. I thought it was so good, but it's another one that's really hard to market and really hard to kind of describe. And with the way the ending takes such a left turn, you're either gonna love it or hate it. But I can't really say much more about it because that's kind of the fun of the story, is to just experience these characters and take that left turn into complete bizarro territory. So that is it. Finally, I am so scared to edit this. I feel like this is gonna end up being like a 2-hour video or something. I feel like I'm in purgatory. I'm in a liminal space right now, and I'm so surprised that I'm at the end. But here we we are. That is it. That is everything for today's video. Let me know what you thought of any of these books if you read them, what books you want to try out, if I convinced you to read any books, if I convinced you to not read any books. Let me know in the comments down below. If you made it all the way to this point and want to let me know you were here but have nothing else to say, leave me a bug emoji in the comments down below. As always, thank you so much for spending some of your time with me while I sit down and talk about books. If you haven't yet, please give the video a like, subscribe for future content, turn on the bell notification, all the fun YouTube things that help your girl out, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Bye!